Okay, now let's talk about two of the things that it's unpleasant, but it's actually inevitable in life, and that is aging and death. Okay, now let's first talk about aging. So what is aging? Well, aging is really accumulation of changes in a human being over time, and this can really include like things like the physical aspect, the psychological aspect, and also the social aspect of changes. Okay, now what causes aging? Well, I have to say that the definitive cause for aging is still unclear, but there are several popular theories that are out there. So the first one is the oxidative stress theory, and the second one is the telomere expansion limit theory, and then the third one is the young factors theory. So each one really has their own substantial amount of scientific evidence that are kind of behind that. And so I'm kind of briefly talk to you about each and every one with you. Okay, the first one is the oxidative stress theory of aging. So the oxidative stress theory of aging kind of postulate that the age-associated reduction in physiological functions are caused by a slow, steady accumulation of oxidative damage. Okay, so what is causing these oxidative damage? Well, that would be the free radicals. So the free radicals are just basically bad stuff that is kind of lost in an electron, and then this electron, what's going to happen is that this molecule that is positively charged is going to start robbing from your body of its own electrons. And then what's going to happen is that it's going to make your cells sick. Okay. Now, if your body doesn't have enough what we call the antioxidants, so there are a lot of antioxidants that are in your body, such as vitamin A, E, C, glutathione. There are I mean, these are a few. I mean, vitamin D is also an antioxidant. So there are a lot of antioxidants in your body. Now, if your body doesn't have enough of this antioxidants, then these free radicals can really create a rampage of attacks and damages on your cellular tissues, and which kind of slowly over time increases with age, and then this is associated with the life expectancies of the organisms. And then at the end, when your body lose enough of these antioxidants and your body is being attacked constantly under the oxidative stress, then your body is going to lose many things such as elasticity, hydration, and also and then it's going to have the cells go through a premature programmed cell death, and then what's going to happen is that this is going to rapidly cause cellular aging in your body. So this is basically one of the theories on what causes aging. Okay, now the second one is the telomere aging theory. Now, if you remember from your high school biology, telomere is a part of the chromosome at the very end. So this is the end cap that protects the cell, but protects the chromosome, right? And then now what you may not know is that every time the cell goes through mitosis or cell division, and when a mother cell is split into two daughter cells, you can see that the telomere shortens and eventually the cell division stops. Okay, and then you can see that so the cells they are not copying themselves endlessly with no end, and you can see that when the telomere basically gets so short that this cell just won't copy itself anymore because there is nothing to protect the chromosome information anymore, and that could lead to a lot of genetic defects if it keeps copying, and that can really cause something a mutation, and your body doesn't want that, right? So this theory pretty much thinks that the telomere length shortens with age, and then and this progressive shortening of the telomere leads to all of these things: the senescence, the apoptosis, and oncogenic transformation of somatic cells. So all of these are going to affect the health and the lifespan of an individual. Now, so you can see that as the telomere gets shorter and shorter, and then of course the cell gets older and older, and the information sometimes don't get retained very well, and then eventually when the cells telomere runs out, it's just going to stop dividing, and therefore your cell does not get regenerated over again. And then so you can also see that the shortened telomeres has been associated with poor things like incidence of diseases and poor survival. So this is something that um, is also a prominent theory when it comes to what contributes to aging. Okay, the next one is the young factors in the blood theory. Okay, so in this school of thought, the belief that aging is caused by an imbalanced chemicals in the body. So as the organism gets older, they believe that there are things that this organism, let's say human, are making too little of or too much of. And all of that is causing an imbalance chemistry in the body. Okay, so essentially, if you can find what is missing and what is too much in, let's say, a person's blood, and you correct that imbalance, and then you will be able to essentially reverse aging. So the things that you will be injecting into the blood is essentially things like the fountain of youth, right? And so how do they do this? They do this by parabiosis studies. So what is parabiosis? Well, they did this in mice, and you see that for obvious ethical reasons. So what they do is they sew the old mouse and the young mouse together, okay? And so yeah, they sew them together. So then they're basically sharing the blood between them, okay? And you can see that now because they're sharing the same blood system. Now what they found is that the old mouse is now start to act and as if it's young again. So it's a behavior in terms of like the intelligence and when it comes to the um, um, behavior studies, as well as the muscle strength and even the heart muscle gets restored to a more youthful state. And on the same time, this young mouse start to behave more like an old mouse because I think some of the old mouse's blood is now in the young mouse, right? So they call this whatever that is lacking in the old mouse in the young mouse, that is the rejuvenation factors. Okay. Now, so how do we find these rejuvenation factors? Well, it's very easy. We draw out the young blood and then we draw out the old blood and we do a thorough chemical analysis of the content that is in the blood, and we can see what is exactly missing or too much in the in the old blood, and we can supplement it back into the old blood. Okay, now indeed, like say when you extract the blood from the young mouse and then just purify it and then get the plasma out, and you inject just the plasma back into the old mouse, then you can see that the old mouse is now start to behave and also have the strength and all of these other things like the muscles that is similar to the young mouse again. And you can also do blood exchange studies between the young mouse and the old mouse. It's very difficult to do, by the way, because these animals are so small. And you can really start to make these old mice young again. So this is something in the future. Maybe we might be able to do this in humans and just by injecting plasma of young people into old people and to see if this can restore them back to a younger state of body and mind. Okay, now since we're in the psychology class, I have to talk about impact of aging on intelligence and on the cognitive abilities. Okay, but before I start, I do want to say that um, there are some things to kind of keep in mind, and that is sample bias in this kind of study. Okay, now imagine that the people that you're studying on this end of the spectrum, you're talking about people in the 70s and the 80s, and the issue is that these are the people that are pre-selected by nature. What do I mean by that? These are people who are probably smarter and more fortunate, so they were able to keep themselves alive to this point. So when you're looking at people in the 20s and the 30s, you're looking at pretty much like everybody in the population, okay? But how many of that can actually survive to 70 and 80s without killing themselves, or without letting some stupid diseases kill themselves, or not paying attention to their own health and then survive to that long? Not everybody. Okay, so you want to think that there are already a selection, a self-selecting bias in this population in when it comes to the 70 and 80s. Okay, so I just want to keep that in mind. So this can be a factor when something that you see in something like the crystallized ability, such as vocabulary. So it could be that people who do survive to this point, they are innately smarter than the people in the 20s in general. Okay, so you can see that the crystallized ability is increased as the person gets older and older. Okay, and then the second piece of evidence is that the fluid abilities decrease, such as what you see here, the processing speed is greatly decreased. But there is an issue with this. I'm going to come back to that. Something I do want to say is that later on, when you see in the next slide, you'll see that older people, they utilize more brains area compared to the young people. Okay, when they are processing exactly the same information. And does this mean that they are stupider? I don't think so. I think it has to do with the strategy that changes. They're trying to maybe incorporate a more aspect of the same thing, and because there are so many memory aspects that are kind of gathered in that. So therefore, there is a slowdown in the processing speed, but not necessarily means that they are getting dumber. Okay, so this is a big premise that you need to kind of keep in mind before we go on from here. So are they necessarily smarter, or were really like and where is it because they're slower, they're dumber? This is something that's still quite difficult to study, and I was repeatedly taught by my professors in aging. Basically said it's simply there is some changes in the strategy in the way that older people engage in their ability to use the brain rather than um, rather than that they're getting dumber. Okay, so this is what I was talking about in the previous slide. That basically old people incorporate more brain areas in the same task compared to the young people. So when we look at the functional magnetic resonance imaging, basically it uses it's kind of like scanning the amount of the hydrogen atoms that are basically out of alignment when you apply a frequency wave. And there's a lot of physics in that. I'm not going to explain that. If you take a cognitive neuroscience class with me in the future semesters, then I can go into like a lot more in detail. So, but the most important thing is just that you need to know, like, whenever you see like a red area like this, that means that this area of the brain is active during the task. Okay, so now let's just take a look at the same task, and that is just where is the difference between the young and the old people. We can see that in the same task, we don't see that much brain activation in the young, right? You see a little bit in the parietal lobe here. You see a little, very, very little bit in the frontal lobe here, but and you don't see that much in the occipital lobe. But then you can see that we see a lot more activities in pretty much all of the areas. We see that in the motor cortex. We see that in the parietal lobe. We see that in the temporal lobe as well as the occipital lobe. A lot of activities. And when we look at in the superior view, we can also see that there are a lot more activities in the old person's brain compared to the young person's brain. And when we look at from the hindsight, so this is the cerebellum that we're seeing here, right? So you can see that even from the hindsight, there are a lot more activity that we see in the old person's brain compared to the young person's brain. Okay, so this is something that we said before, and this is most likely due to some sort of strategic changes that an old person is simply trying to evoke more of the memories that are associated with this kind of task, just due to gaining more of the experience, and therefore the kind of the brain that it needs to incorporate and in the same task gets a little bit more, and therefore when you try to recruit a lot of the same a lot of different brain areas that and doing the same task, and then what's going to happen is invariably it's going to slow you down in terms of processing speed because it involves many more synapses compared to the young person. So, in other words, the way that young people think and the old people think are very different. The young people would kind of think that this A leads to B and that's it. Okay. But old people would think more like A leads to B, leads to C, leads to Z, blah, 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 leads to X, Y, Z, and blah, blah, blah. And then come back and say, oh, yes, 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 it does lead to B. And then it kind of thinks everything that is possible that may be kind of throughout and maybe including everything that is the consequences of the things of what happens if I push this button and things like that. So and you can see that a lot, maybe it's because this is something that enabled them to survive to an older age, but maybe not. So as I said before, we are not studying this, we might not be studying the same population of people, right? There might be a certain characteristics that enable these old people to survive to a much older age compared to the young age. Okay, now what else is different from the brain scan from a young person compared to an old person? Okay, so over here, one of them is a young brain, another one is an old brain scan. Which one do you think is a brain scan from an old person? And which one do you think is the one from a young person? Okay, now if you say that B is from an old person, then you are right, okay? Um, so what happens is that what we know is that there are a lot of brain atrophy in aging brain. Okay, and what do we mean by that? That means that the amount of the gyrus, so that are these kind of things, okay, that the amount of the gyration that is in the brain become more prominent. And why are they becoming prominent? And that's because there is significant amount of the brain volume atrophy or shrinkage. Okay, so what happens when your brain gets is that becomes smaller, and the capacity of the cells that you can actually devoted to process the kind of information is also smaller. Okay, and which may be a reason why, in order to get the same task that an old person need to elicit and recruit many more brain areas, because now they need the recruitment of additional neurons that contain similar information to help them to actually get the same task done. So something that we know for sure is that there are a lot more neurodegeneration that is going on in the brain, which often means that there are more cell death, uh, specifically neuronal death that is happening in the older brain. There are expansion of the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, and that is just simply because there are atrophy of the actual brain tissue. Okay, now the number of the synapses are also decreased during aging. So you can see over here, this is what on the x-axis, what we have is the number of years. Okay, and then on the y-axis, what we have is synaptic density from the percentage. Okay, so you can see that from 25 years of age for a smart person, that's what they mean by reserve. Okay, so if you have like a normal reserve, that means that your reserve is about like normal compared to other people. And if you have decreased reserve, that means you have just less amount of dendritic spine. They might mean that you are dumber, but not necessarily true. But usually, yes, that means yes. You if you are have less cognitive reservoir, that you're considered not as fortunate intellectually compared to other people. Okay, so now let's take a look at if you belong to the normal reserve and the normal aging, you just see a steady decrease from here in the black solid line. Okay. Now, if you are in the normal reserve, but if you have normal aging plus AD, Alzheimer's disease, okay, you can see that this is going to rapidly decrease your number of the synapses, starting from the point that you start to get inflicted by the disease. So that's the um, dotted black line. Okay. Now, if you have like a normal cognitive reservoir and you have slow aging, that means that your number of the synapses there are not going to decrease so much. So for instance, what do we mean by slower aging? So let's say if you are very good, if you keep up with your exercises, you don't sleep deprive yourself, you don't smoke, you don't drink, you eat your vegetables, you take the vitamins with the antioxidants and stuff like that. And so basically, just take care of yourself really well. That's going to contribute to slower aging, and then you are going to preserve a lot of your synapses. Okay. Now, what happens if you have like a decreased reservoir? Then what happens that you start with a smaller amount of the synapses, and then but you can see that you are decreasing in the same parallel line compared to the normal reserve and normal aging. Okay, but something that we know that is consistently true is that no matter what you do, even with slower aging, you can see that the number of synapses are going to be decreased when you age. Okay, now let's talk about four stages of aging. So this was proposed by Gene Cohen, who is an American geriatric psychiatrist who kind of, based on his studies over the years, kind of suggests what the four stages of agings are. Okay, now the first stage of aging is the midlife reevaluation. So this goes from mid 30s to mid 60s. So phase one is more of a period of quest more than a crisis. So it involves the search for truth and meaning. So things like where have I been? Where am I now? Where am I going in life? So people in this phase commonly confront their mortality, kind of accept that one day they will die. And then now, although for some this produces anxiety, the inner push usually results in an exciting new look at what we want in our life. And so this may mean doing something differently or something entirely new with your life. So midlife people often become less impulsive, more thoughtful about their work, about their life, and about their life's choices, and also they're more open to life's complexities, and they're also more aware of their feelings. Okay, so now meanwhile the brain is kind of helping that inner push by expanding the corpus callosum. Okay, so this increase the integration of both sides of the brain, kind of produce more balance between the analytical and the intuitive side. So this results in greater productivity and a stronger sense of self. So it's a great time to start a new project with new direction, basically. Okay. Now, phase two is liberation, and this goes from late 50s to the 70s. Okay, so this is a time for like experimentation and innovation. So basically, you can see that there are more actually in this point. There are slightly more neurons that are being grown at somehow at this stage, and then so the inner push is toward liberation, not kind of compliances, but it's also kind of toward innovation and willingness to take risks. Because a lot of time we kind of think about what is happening during this stage. This is during their retirement, right? So for them, retirement means that this is time for them to do something that they have always wanted to do. So the stuff that they might have been bogged down by the job, bogged down by the kids, bogged down by the marriage. Now they can suddenly live their life. And but then so the questions that they usually have is something like, well, if not now, then when? So why not? Okay. All right, now the third phase is summing up. So this kind of goes through late 60s through the 80s. So this is a time to kind of review and resolution um and to get like desire to give back to the world. And then so the review of this life kind of usually comes to like a recognition of your own meaning, right? So it's a time for putting things like the photos in albums, writing memoirs, writing your life stories. It may be that the richness of the autobiography activities is kind of helped out by the ability to use the and left by the right side of the brain simultaneously. So now Cohen speculate that the brain kind of relishes the summing up activities. So you can see that Cohen's research indicate that 80% of this summing up phase do some sort of volunteer work to kind of give back to the community. Right? So the common questions during the stages are things like, what is the meaning of my life? How do I give back and make world a better place than I came? Are there any kind of unresolved conflict in my life that I can make it right during this stage? Okay, now the fourth stage is the final stage, and that is the encore. Okay, so and this kind of goes from the late 70s until the end of the life. Now, in stage four, Cohen sees that their inner push foster a reflection and celebration of life. So he notes that that this phase continual aspect, there are three. There's still re-examination, re-evaluation of your life, liberation, and also summing up. Okay, now the thing about this is that so this is why he named it encore. Okay, so it's used in a sense of like in French meaning like continuing encore. So if when you are in a concert, people usually yell encore, encore, and it means one more, right? So it means you are just kind of doing the revaluation, the liberation, and summing up again. And then now during this stage, there are still a lot of because you basically just have such a newfound appreciation of life, and so this is the time if you have like a good life, you can really have like a good satisfaction and psychological resilience. And also during this time, the positive emotions and morals are really supported a lot by things like that your family member, and there are also some changes that's going on in the amygdala that Cohen believes that are supporting this as well. Okay, now I'm gonna switch gears and talk about death and the grief process. Now, of course, we know that death is a inevitable part of life, and then this is something that it's not easy to accept, whether if it's your own death or the death of a loved one, and that's because they are not physically with you anymore, and then there is a certain bond that gets broken, and then this is something that gets very difficult for a lot of people, and that's what the grief process is really about. Okay, now something that we know is that the cause of death has changed a lot in the last century. Okay, so in the last 100 years, the first world country's life expectancy has increased about 20 to 25 years. Countries like United States, Canada, or like the Western Europe countries, they have the life expectancy has really increased dramatically, and you will see that the main cause of death really changed from like a lot of like infectious disease such as tuberculosis and other infectious diseases to more chronic ones such as stroke, heart attack, cancer, and stuff like that. And of course, this is thanks to the advance in medicine, that a lot of things are treatable now, even though they might not be a permanent cure, but then they are treatable, and this really has really extended the life expectancy of people in general. Okay, now let's talk about the biological aspect of death. So the physical aspect death is when the vital organ starts to fail and basically not working anymore. So you're looking at things like heart not pumping anymore, where the person is not breathing, and things like that. Okay, and now in the clinical sense, this is when the brain ceases to function. So when there are no responses in the EEG, then this becomes a major problem when it comes to the person. And a lot of it, they will start to announce that this person has been dead. All right, now let's talk about the psychological and social aspect of death and dying. So the psychological part is that when a person finally accepts that they will die soon and then start to withdraw from others, they become very quiet. And there are a lot of indicators that a person has now kind of found peace that he or she will die soon. And these are the things that you look for and now this can really happen long time, could be a long time, could be a short time before their actual physical death. Okay. There's also the social aspect of death. So this is when people like the friends and family, they start to visit less and less because maybe they feel uncomfortable. And then in China, we know that there are people who just kind of think that it's not good to try to visit someone who is about to die. They think that maybe this is a sign of unlucky. They don't want something like that. So this is something that is also relatively common in the Chinese culture. Um, there are also things such as when the clinicians start to pay less attention to this person's attention. So then, because they think that this patient is on their way out. Okay, now what is there a process in which that a person comes to accept his or her own death, or also maybe the death of someone who is very close to them? So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross really explained and described this very well. So they kind of go in stages. So it goes from it goes from denial to anger to bargaining to depression and to acceptance. Okay, so the first one is denial. Okay, so the first reaction, this is very common. So in this stage, individual believes that the diagnosis is like mistaken, and then they really cling on to like the reality that they prefer. Now, the second stage is anger. Okay, so this happens when they realize that the denial cannot keep continuing, then they become very upset. And then they do this, especially they take it out on the people that they love. And so they go through something like this. They go, why me? This is not fair. How could this happen to me? Who can I blame this? Why did this happen? So this is the stage of anger that they usually go through on the second stage of grief. Okay, now the next stage is bargaining. Okay, so this is involves the hope that the individual can avoid a cause of the grief. So then this is usually the negotiation of extended life and in exchange for a reformed lifestyle. So then something like, oh, if I go to church every day, and then can I live to go to my daughter's wedding? Now I want to say that during this bargaining stage, you can actually utilize this to the most advantage to yourself. So you can do something like, okay, if I turn myself around, if I stop eating all the unhealthy food and I start doing very healthy, if I quit smoking, I quit drinking, and then I go to, let's say, my chemotherapy, and I listen to what my doctor has to say. Can I maybe turn my stage 2 cancer into something that doesn't exist? And do people have people successfully done this? Absolutely. So this is something that you do want to kind of utilize to your own advantage. And of course, the best way is that you want to live healthy and prevent that from happening in the first place. Okay, um, so this is something that so bargaining can you can really actually use this to your advantage and turn it around because this is when a person can actually make the most amount of difference. So this is kind of like their last ditch effort trying to get their life back. And do some actually successfully doing so? Yes, there are people who absolutely doing this stage that decided to turn their life around. They decided to turn their health around, and then they defy all the odds. They beat cancer. They have been cancer free for like 10 years and stuff like that. Now these people are not the majority of people, but I do want to say that the psychology of the mind is a really amazing thing. So now, of course, you should always go to a doctor. You should always listen to a doctor when you are sick. Okay. Uh, okay. The next stage is depression. Okay. So of course, after they realize that there is no bargaining or the bargain has failed, or let's say if they really try everything that they could and but their body is still deteriorating, then they would go into a deep depression that say, why should I bother with everything? Things like something like this, I'm not gonna read it because so something like what's the point? I don't see what the meaning of life. And so now during this stage, the individual they really in deep despair, okay, and so they really realize they can't die at one day, and then what happened is that they become very silent and they refuse visitors, and then they spend much more of the time mourning and solemn. Okay, so this is the last stage, and that is acceptance. Okay, so this is the thought that they finally accepted their own mortality and that they will die someday, and then, or it could be also like a loved one that has happened, or something like a tragic event. So then what happened is that then they start to feel peace inside, and then they start to kind of reflect back on their life in retrospect. So this is something actually is the healthy stage when it comes to the acceptance of their own mortality. And you see that when you are grieving for someone that you love, and this is exactly the same process as well. Okay, now let's talk about what is beyond death. Where do we go after we die? Well, I can't tell you that personally, but there are records of people who have officially died and then come and was brought back to life. So these are what we call the near-death experiences. Okay, so there are people who might actually been like officially announced dead for maybe like an hour or so, and then but then somehow they came back to life, and then they would talk about their experiences in terms of what they saw during that time when they were announced officially dead. Okay. Now, so this is something that is a profound personal experience that's associated with death, with impending death, and that. So now the researchers claim similar characteristics. Okay, now I do want to say that there are positive experiences and there are negative experiences. Okay, but overwhelmingly, most people's experiences are positive. Okay, so the experiences. May encompass a variety of sensations, including detachment from the body. So this is kind of saying like this, maybe your spirit is leaving the body. You are feeling the levitation. You feel like you're floating, and then they something that they usually explain is something like a great amount of serenity and peace, security, warmth, and then some people will actually say the presence of light. Okay, um, now in small amount of people, they would say that these are all there are negative experiences. So there are things like there may be sensations of anguish and distress, and something of like a total horror in people who had a near-death experience. Okay, now let's talk about the scientific explanation of the near-death experiences. Now, of course, there are spiritual as well as religious explanation of the near-death experiences, but I'm not going to talk about it today because we're not in a religion class. I just do want to say that I do believe that we are not just our bodies, we're not just our heart pumping, we're not just our breathing, and we're not just a bunch of neurons firing around. I do believe that there is some sort of essence that make us us, because and that is essentially what makes us different from a dead corpse versus a living person walking around. And so I do think that there is an essence, and your body is just kind of like your vehicle that you use that to kind of walk around. So I think as an analogy, the what I kind of want to say is that if you kind of think your body as a computer, and then the energy that is universally that is kind of like the chi, that is like the electricity that gives a computer, but you are actually giving what the computer commands. Okay, so you are actually the consciousness that is driving or operating the computer as well as the electricity. Now, the electricity kind of enables you to do something like that. Um, so I think that's the simplest explanation as how I actually think. But if you don't agree with me, that's fine. Because you are. This is something that is more like a personal choice. When it comes to spirituality and religion. But anyway, so the scientific explanation of the near-death experiences is that some of them think that there are low oxygen. Okay, so when the oxygen is low in the blood, that is going to actually cause the neurons to fire like crazy, and they're going to release a lot of the neurotransmitters. And a lot of these neurotransmitters are actually things that are very precious in the body. So like all the endorphins. Okay, so these are the things that make you really peaceful, and that might actually make you see light, because this can actually make the neurons in your occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision, to kind of fire a lot. And then this is why a person who has a near-death experience may actually see the light. Okay. Now, another reason is this person might have hypercarbia, which is accumulation of too much carbon dioxide. And so this could also have a similar effect on the brain as well. Okay. Okay, now you're probably thinking that, well, okay, what happened to these people that had a near-death experiences? So I can tell you something, and that is that all of them have some sort of changes in their perspective in life. And essentially, they come back a changed person. It doesn't really matter if they had a positive experience or a negative experience. For the people who had a positive experience, they usually say something like they are no longer that afraid of death, because they have been dead like once before, and then that was actually not such a horrible experience. Okay, so so this is something they kind of also put their life that was kind of after they returned back to planet Earth, something that is much in more perspective compared to what they have been doing before. Then they realize that they really should spend time with the people that they care about and do the things that they really want to do. and then be a kind person and be a loving person. These are the kind of things that they will actually do more in their life. So it's not uncommon that people after they had a near-death experience to actually completely change professions. And then the way that they also interact with other people, it has also changed. Now you can say something like that's because there is some sort of brain damage during that time in when they were dead, or because there are so much of these neurotransmitters that are firing and that just completely change the plasticity in the brain. That could also be one of the main reason. Right now, we haven't really studied that much of the people's brain that had a near-death experience. So right now we can't say that much we can't say that much definitively, okay? But all every for the people who had a negative experiences, um, surprisingly, not a lot of them are like kind of afraid of death. But then you see that they also kind of change for the better. So, for instance, there was a drug dealer who actually a gangster, okay, who came back from the near-death experiences, and then he decided to become a preacher. He decided to become a pastor. Okay, um, in and just devoted his life in church. I mean, and maybe because he kind of associated that negative experience of going to hell. He doesn't want to experience that again. So he also changed his life. So do these people afraid of dying? I'm not so sure, but I kind of think that maybe hopefully with their life being changed for the better, maybe they won't be so afraid of dying anymore. And but everything that all kind of became common for these people, and even if they were atheists before, these people they start to believe in some sort of afterlife that is after the world after we die. I don't have an answer to this, but I'm just kind of telling you guys what is actually being said by a lot of the research and also the interviews of the people who had the near-death experience. Now, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, there are a lot of information. I'll post the there are some posts in the next slide. Okay, so here are the resources. Parnia and Van Lommel, they wrote a book called What Happens When We Die. So these are two physicians. They saw a lot of patients that had a near-death experiences. So they kind of collected all these stories and then they interviewed some of these patients after they came back and to kind of talk about their experiences. And then down here, this is a PubMed article that they wrote, and then kind of go into a lot of studies and cases that were about near-death experiences.